kick off. So, Matt, maybe we'll just start off with some introductions.
Sounds good. Okay.
Oh,
Shall I kick it off?
Yeah, Matt, that'd be great. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. I'm Matt Fellows, one of the core maintainers of Pact. I look after Pact.js, or anything to do with JavaScript and Node. And I also look after Pact.go for Golang. I'm involved with various other aspects of the community, including some of the Rust work and obviously roadmap and things like this. And I'm also the co-founder of Pactflow alongside some of my other colleagues and work alongside Alicia. Alicia?
Thank you. I'll just do a quick intro. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just doing some introductions, just letting you know as well that we're recording this session. So my name's Alicia Foreman. I work with Matt in the Pactflow team. My role is product marketing, and I'm hosting today's session. As you would have seen, we're hosting an Ask Me Anything session. We've got a couple of questions that we've tabled already, which I'm going to ask Matt, but I thought maybe if we wanted to kick off and just see if anyone who has joined now, if you are at a sort of a time cap, you can ask your questions of Matt from now.
Thanks, Alicia. So yeah, happy to take questions if anyone's on the call would like to ask. I think we'll take silences there. They're very excited to hear some of the questions we're going to answer. So maybe we'll just get stuck into those, hey?
Happy to do that. All right, so we've got three questions that we're going to ask during this session. We'll just kick that off now. So these questions that we've tabled are some of the most common questions that we've seen in the Slack, the Pact Slack channel over the past fortnight. So the first one we'll kick off with is, what is best practice use of Lambda and async, Matt?
Yeah, it's a pretty popular question. So a lot of people don't actually know that Pact can do asynchronous services. It is there on the documentation, but by and large, I think most of the community just knows about Pact for RESTful microservices. I think we've actually had support for async for since at least 2016, if not earlier. And the first implementation of that was actually for Kafka, I believe. So it was created to deal with Kafka, but the way Pact message works is a little bit different. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm just going to take us to some documentation to just try and illustrate the point here. In fact, I'm going to go to docs first. But the first thing to note about message Pact is that if you go to our documentation, go to how Pact works, we have two sections, one on the standard HTTP testing, but also a whole section on non-HTTP testing. So for those of you who are familiar with Pact, you'll know that the way HTTP Pact works is that there's an actual request and response that goes on, and it actually requires your code to actually make an HTTP call to the mock provider on the consumer side, and on the provider side, when the Pact verifies when the Pact framework verifies the contract, it's going to issue an actual HTTP call to your actual provider running locally. So it does actually use the HTTP system and transport and protocol. With non-HTTP testing, or what we call message Pact, we're actually one level abstracted from that. So what we do is we actually remove the protocol here. We actually don't care about the protocol. And then one of the main reasons for this is if we tried to do that, we would need to create an adapter for every single message queue you can possibly think of. So Kinesis, Kafka, SNS, SQS, ActiveMQ, RabbitMQ, WebSockets, gRPC, the list goes on. So we're not going to do that. And even if we did do that, what value is Pact going to give over and above the tools that do that really well already? So we just felt like it didn't make sense to actually do that. What it does make sense to do, though, is check the message format that gets put onto a queue and to be able to deserialize that and handle that on the other side of the queue. So as far as message Pact testing goes, you don't actually care about the protocol, the transport. We're just looking at the payload. That does require you to structure your code in a certain way that means you can separate the two of those things. So we have some sort of documentation that talks about that here. But one way to think about it, and the way I think about it, and this is my documentation for it, is that you've probably got various ways of abstracting your code already. So there's different ways of thinking about that. Ports and adapters. There's clean architectures. There's robust, solid, and all these kinds of things, right? So let's use the hexagonal architecture here, or ports and adapters. And the way we can think about this is separating the adapter to the outside world. So in this case, let's say we're dealing with a Lambda. So Lambda is a particular runtime, specific to Amazon. So your main code that does actual work really should not know that it's running in a Lambda runtime. It shouldn't care about that. So we should have a piece of code that's responsible for doing the Lambda bits, and then really doing the Lambda stuff, and then converting it into a format that some other piece of code is able to handle, that it does no idea that's to do with Lambda. So that's our adapter. The second layer underneath this is what we call a port to the inside world. So often things like services will be your kind of port. So it might be, for example, an order service or a product service, and it might talk to various other things to do some function, but it has no idea that's running in Lambda or that's running in HTTP or what have you. And then, of course, at the bottom level, you can have things like your domain model and other collaborators and things like this, and down to the business logic level. So being able to structure your code that way gives you flexibility in how you test it. So what we're going to do, if I scroll down a bit further, let's say our consumer expects a JSON payload that looks a bit like this. So it's got an ID, type, name, version, and event. So in this case, let's say it's a product event or something. Over here on our consumer side, looking at our adapter, we're going to have a Java handler. So let's say it looks like this. Just zooming in, it's an asynchronous promise. In this case, you can translate that to other languages. And all it's going to do is take the Amazon Lambda specific event that comes in, and it's going to look over all the records in the way Amazon deals with things, and just extract out the actual event from that. And then what it's going to do is pass it down to a function called, in this case, receive product update. And so this is your adapter. It doesn't do anything to do with your actual service. It's really just about talking to the outside world. So the actual thing doing the real work here is receive product event. Again, it doesn't know it's part of Lambda, but it's responsible for getting a product and doing the thing that this function should do. So in this case, it's going to receive the product event and install it into the repository or save it in the repository. So you can see here, this function, is a pure JavaScript kind of function, takes a product and just stores that value in the repository. And our pack test is just going to check that this thing is able to receive that data. It's not going to check this thing up here because that's too Lambda specific. On the provider side or the producer side, we're obviously going to do something very similar. We need to be able to separate the thing that publishes the event from the thing that actually produces the event. And so publishing is going to be is very much protocol specific, and the creating of the event itself is going to be unrelated to that thing, right? So let's say, again, it's just publishing a product. We don't care, the core piece of code that's going to be published in this product probably has no idea it's dealing with Kafka or Lambda or SQS or whatever. It just needs to produce some event. So here you can see we've got two functions inside this product event service, one that creates event, one that updates. And ultimately, you can see that there's a piece of code that says product from JSON. So just scrolling down a little bit, publish is going to be our adapter. This is the thing that knows how to talk to, in this case, Amazon SNS. But actually, update down here, deals with this product event from event JSON. So this is actually what we're going to test as part of our packed test. So there is a code base here that we reference that talks to both the consumer and provider side, so you can kind of see how that actually runs in action. But I'll just want to talk through the abstract sort of sense for now. I'll pause there just because I don't talk for too long. I'm happy to take any questions on that if anyone here would. Yeah, we've got a raised hand there.
Yes, I've got so very nice for clarifying this. This was definitely a question we had. We are on RabbitMQ, and so thanks. It's very clear. The next question that comes to mind, it's not directly related, is what do you exactly call a contract? Like, how far does it go to the typing? My understanding is that you check the types, but maybe I'm already wrong on this. That the type matches in terms of format of the keys provided, and maybe as well as is it a string when we expect a string, that kind of thing. Or, I'm not exactly sure how far that goes in terms of
what's the boundary of the contract?
Well, I guess you understand the question.
I think so, yeah. So we do, that's a good question. So I think just rephrasing that maybe, I hear that as kind of what's the boundary of a contract test? What's the scope of it? And what's
yes, exactly.
Yep. So it's a good question. We try to make a few cases for that in the doc summary as well. I think so. It's probably actually over here in just double checking where it is. You think I'd remember off the top of my head? I think it's over here. You know, it's for contract testing and not for functional testing. So there's a bit of a section here that kind of talks through that. I won't read through that verbatim now, but the way to think about it is contract testing is designed to capture miscommunication errors. So it's not a functional testing thing. So it's certainly not going to check that, let's say in this case, the product event was published and that you know, it was written to a database. That's a side effect. So kind of largely one intuition is we don't care about side effects. That's a job of a functional test. And so contract tests are really about, can the two systems communicate with one another effectively? So you can think about that like, do we know the various types of requests our consumer needs to be able to make or data it needs to be able to get? And can the provider do that? Now, part of your question, I think, is around schemas and things like this.
Yes, is there a specific language to declare a schema, or can I use the one I already have, or that's...
Yes, so the kind of no and yes. So there's an article I'll point to you that sort of talks about how schemas are not contracts. In fact, I need to actually write a new article that just talks about that one problem. There's a 3-part series that talks about schemas and things like this. A schema is a narrow view of what data is available. It cannot be accepted. So in case of a JSON schema, again, it's a somewhat narrow view in the sense that it says, given these inputs potentially, these are the potential outputs. What a schema typically can't do, and JSON schema is definitely included, and OpenAPI spec is included also because it uses JSON schema, it won't be able to tell you necessarily which exact inputs map to which exact outputs. So let's expand this to an OpenAPI spec for an example. Let's say you have a polymorphic response payload. In a case of a schema, in a case of an OpenAPI spec, you can say, given this input, these are the potential outputs I can get. But in reality, how do you know which set of inputs produce which set of outputs in which scenarios? So a schema can give you a general sense of that. It can tell you the data model is correct or not. What it can't tell you is, though, what the consumer actually needs. And does the provider actually do that? And so that actually causes some issues. So if you're using tools like Dread or whatever that do OAS testing, most of those tools, none that I know of, can actually do it properly. All they can tell you is that you're compatible or you're not incompatible with the spec. It won't tell you that you implement the spec. And the reason for that is they're too abstract. Yeah. So coming back to why contract testing is a bit different, contract testing adds a few different things. It adds the specific scenarios that the consumer is actually using and enforces the provider to make sure they can do that. So we call that specification by example. The second thing contract testing will do is give you evolution. So it gives you the tools to evolve your contract over time. They're probably the two main intuitions about contract tests, a bit different. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, I'll read further. Thanks.
You're welcome. So probably a good time to pause. Were there any other questions while we're here? We've got a few people on the call, so it's good to see. Okay. Should we move on to question number 2, Alicia?
Let's go, Matt. So one of the other popular questions from the Slack channel recently has been, can I generate a packed file from an open API definition?
Oh yeah, that was a good segue. No. So actually in Pactflow you kind of can. We'll talk about that separately. With Pact, there is actually, where is it? There's probably, I forget what it's called. I use the search more than anybody, I think. No, FAQ, sorry. So I think there's a question here for it. Can I generate my Pact file from Swagger? So probably a first call out, if you do have these kind of questions, we often put the answers for those in this FAQ, and we probably should update it again after this. The reason why you can't generate a Pact file from your Swagger spec is there's a few reasons. One is that, well, in fact, I might actually read this article answer because it's actually quite good. I'll just skip down to the main thing. So here is basically the main thing. So manually writing or generating a Pact file from something like a Swagger document, it will be like marking your own exam. and it wouldn't actually check to see that your code is actually compatible with one another. So basically what that means is on the consumer side, we actually make sure your code does what you said it would do. And Pact will fail the test if your code doesn't do that. So for example, you say, my code is about to make a call to get some order, /orders 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you run your test. And if your code doesn't actually hit that endpoint, Pact will fail and say, no, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. We're not going to serialize that contract, because when we serialize a contract, we now need to make sure the provider can do it. If you just took the provider's OpenAPI spec, then generated your Pact file, all you're doing is taking what the provider said it can do and then generating a contract that says what it can do. So that doesn't help you prove A, that your code actually does that, and B, it doesn't really prove a whole lot more for the provider anyway. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if you did do that, you now would lose the information about specifically what consumer was actually using what API endpoints, and specifically within those endpoints, what fields they were using. So if you have a Pact test that says I only need these 3 fields, when in reality the provider actually has 50 fields, well, now, unfortunately, if you did that, you're now just going to assume that consumer uses all the fields. And so now you can't remove a property if a consumer needs it. So to give you an idea what I mean, if I share my screen for a second, let's have a look. Present my whole screen. Excuse me. No, not that one. Screen sharing. And we'll just pick this one for now. So let's assume this is actually our consumer. This is a consumer? This is a provider. So let's say our provider has these 5 fields. The consumer only used the name, the type, and the ID. Now I wouldn't be able to remove this field on the provider side, because everyone on the consumer now automatically needs those properties, even if they're not using them. So that means I can't evolve my provider API very easily, because now all my consumers look the same to me. And therefore I might as well not even have a contract test, because the contract is basically, do I have a consumer and what's your name? Because I assume they're using everything. So if you generate it from a Swagger file, now you have to assume every consumer consumes your entire interface. So Pact gives you the tools to specifically ask for which fields you care about and which endpoints you care about. And so you get to see the surface area that your actual API is being used. And then there's notwithstanding the OpenAPI problems we talked about before. Now, a brief side note, in terms of generating contract tests, you don't want to do it this way. The other question that kind of comes with that, though, is, well, can we integrate it better into the ecosystem? And so with a Pactflow point of view, one of the things we've been doing is what we're calling bidirectional contracts. And bidirectional contracts allows you to decouple yourself a little bit. It means a provider can do BYO its own tool to test itself and publish the OpenAPI spec as a provider contract. And on the consumer side, you would upload a Pact contract, or you could generate a Pact contract from other stubs. And there's a big qualification there. So the issue we're saying with generating a Pact file from Swagger means that we're not sure your code's doing what it's doing. So with this flow, as long as you have stubs that your code's actually calling, well, now we know your code's actually doing it, because those stubs should be working. So we can then convert those stubs into a Pact file and upload that as a consumer contract. And then what Pact will do is it will ensure that it actually they're compatible. So I'll just get a screen going so you can see what I'm talking about here, because that sounded a bit abstract. I don't know why that's not showing up as an option for me, but okay, I see. All right, everyone. Yeah. Okay. Somewhere down here, there should be a slide about how this works. Here we go. So basically, the way this would work is, on the consumer side, it doesn't actually happen from the consumer. It can go from consumer or the provider. So let's say the consumer says, I'm going to write some tests against a mocking service. You can use Pact, because Pact obviously has a mock, or you can use other tools. So let's say Cypress has, mocking tools and stubbing tools. You might be using Mountebank, you might be using WireMock, whatever. Your code actually talks to this mock and you validate that works. So at the end of that process, you're going to produce a consumer contract. If you're not using Pact, you just need to create a small adapter to convert it into a Pact file. In the case of what I did with a knock recently, it was like 20, 25 lines of code. So very easy. You produce your consumer contract, that goes up to Pactflow. On the provider side, you start with your open API spec and you bring your own provider testing tool. And then you check that your provider is compatible with that spec. So the same qualification there. You can't tell if it's actually fully implemented, but you're checking if it's compatible. And we're building some tools to try and solve that problem as well. That gets uploaded to Pactflow. So there's two contracts here. There's a consumer side contract and a provider side contract. And the whole process can be initiated from either side. What happens after it gets published to Pactflow is that we have this ability, what we call cross-contract verification or validation. When you run a can I deploy check later on, what Pact will do is go, is this consumer contract on the left-hand side a valid subset of the provider contract? So for example, we know the consumer's only using one of these endpoints, but we can say, is that endpoint in the open API spec and does it match that schema? So it doesn't quite have the same level of guarantees as Pact, but it does give you some extra benefits above the problems we were talking about before. But it also, because of this ability to be decoupled, you can move a lot faster. So when a consumer adds new properties to that consumer contract, if that's already in the open API spec the provider has, there's no need to rerun provider builds. That's just going to sail straight through to production. And vice versa. It means the providers can actually get going before the consumers, which you can't do with consumer-driven contracts at the moment. So I'll just pause it there. But if you want to know more about that, obviously just drop us a note afterwards. Happy to take you through that in more detail. Maybe a good time to pause for questions again, Alicia?
For sure. Does anyone who's joined have any questions? You can pop them in the chat if you want, or just take yourself off mute and shout out. If not, I'll ask that final question that we've got on the agenda today.
Also, minor shout out to Nathan Deemer. Hello. Long time no speak.
Hey, Matt. How you doing?
Very good. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Cool. All right.
Cool. So should we get through our last question? So Matt, the last question again, one of the popular questions from Slack recently, where do tests run? A unit, CI, against production, or in dev?
Yep, great question. It does surprisingly come up a fair bit. Personally, I think the answer is really straightforward. It runs in dev, runs in CI, and you don't need to point it to a real environment. So the main reason to run Pact is to shift this as shift left, right. So what you talk about shift left processes. So you're all aware of this. You can't really get more shifted left than the actual development machine, really. So we do get a lot of testers or people working in testing functions wanting to use Pact, and there's value in doing that. The flow I just mentioned before, that sort of bidirectional flow, that's actually more suited to that kind of workflow because you can do it in a black box style test. But Pact is really a white box style test. It needs to have access to the code base. You need to run it like a unit test. And that usually means that you're either a developer or you're an SDET, but you're working on the team and you're embedded in the team and you have access to the code base. So you're not going to be able to do Pact testing really unless you have that. You can do it, but it just gets really hard. And therefore, because of that, you're not really going to be pointing at an external environment. You certainly could, but really it makes no sense to do that. So it makes sense to run it locally. There are exceptions. So for example, on the provider side, you may have a legacy code base, and that code base just can't be run locally for whatever reason. It's too big, it's too hard, it requires special hardware, it runs on Solaris, whatever. So you can still do provider verification externally. So you could still point at an external environment that's running that system and do it that way. And there are facilities to do it that way, and you can. It's just not as easy because it does mean you're probably not going to run it from your laptop. You're going to have to run that through CI or potentially later in your pipeline. So the ideal flow is to really be able to run it on your laptop or your desktop, whatever you work with. So that's that part of it. And of course, you'd run it on your laptop regularly. You're not going to publish things to Pactflow from to the Pact broker from your laptop, but you're going to be integrating to pull it down to verify. So ideally, as much as you can on your laptop.
Lovely. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, can see if another few faces have joined. Oh, here we go. Okay.
So, Matt, we've got a question. 2 questions actually popped up in chat. Can ask those here for you. So, excuse my pronunciation. Is it Emerick? Is that correct?
Yes, Emerick. Emerick.
Emerick,
It's fine. Pronounce it as you wish.
Apologies.
French name. No, it's fine.
Thank you. The question is, how locked in with Pact technology are we once we start using it? Can we download all our packs and run checks ourselves or via another provider?
Are you talking about Pact or Pactflow? I assume Pact? Yeah.
I'm not very sure of the difference. It's a good occasion to clarify.
Sure. Let me clarify that first. So Pact itself is an open source tool, and Pact Broker, again, another open source tool. So in terms of vendor lock-in, you might be locked into the open source vendor, as in that. Where Pactflow comes in, Pactflow adds a couple of things. The main thing is we have our own commercial version of the Pact Broker. So basically, think of Pactflow as the Pact Broker with more stuff. It basically levels up your contract testing. Helps. Our main thing is to help customers do it more quickly and at scale. So there's a whole bunch of features in there around like security and user management and roles and permissions. And then there's the functional side of things. So for example, the bidirectional contracts, that's a Pactflow only feature. So that's the main difference. So if you went to Pactflow, obviously there's going to be a level of vendor lock-in because of that. But we work with the open source tools, so you can always drop back out, notwithstanding the bidirectional contract stuff. Okay. With Pact, Pact itself is open source. I mean, I can't comment too much. Any open source tool, unless there's a comparable thing, it's going to be hard to move across. So, yeah. But yes, you can get all your data and all those kinds of things, whether you're doing with Pactflow or not. You're not going to be locked in that way. So I'll just make that comment as well. Yep. You got another question as well, I think.
Yeah. Do you want me to ask it of you, Matt?
Yes. What benefit do we get at the very start of the adoption? Because you say that if you have all your tests covered, then you can say that this property is not needed anymore. You can drop it. Well, obviously, at the very first, if you have an existing code base and you start adding those tests, at first you don't get that kind of benefit. Can we still have a higher level of confidence anyway?
So the analogy we use, I'll just check to see if I have a quick slide that covers this, and I'll point to it if I do. Think of it as like a link in a chain. So you think about those chain links, right? Let's say you're picking up a big weight from a chain, right? The way Pact wants to work is the principle of mathematical induction. So if A then B, then B then C, then C then D, then you can assert A then D, right? Now, that makes sense for certain chains of functions. So let's say you do have a request. Let's say it's taking an order. That order taking thing needs to go through a few APIs. You're not going to be able to rely on a contract test unless that whole pathway is covered in contract tests or by other means. So you're not going to be able to guarantee. You're not going to give yourself safety until that chain has been done. So you need to work out what chains there are in your systems to make sure that you've got those covered. That's just a general point. Of course, there's more value than just making sure you've covered chains. So I would say that at least starting the contract testing journey is usually enough to start thinking differently about those APIs and how you integrate and evolve and release them and so on. So there is some incremental value in doing that, but of course you're going to get the most value when the chains are covered. So for example, we've seen lots of use cases where consumers just do the contract test, even if the providers don't do it, because it documents what they're actually doing with the system. And then that's where the testing type roles do come in and go, oh, cool. Well, even though they're not verifying it yet, we can see what the consumers are doing, and we can see that and use that as useful documentation to see how the system hangs together. So there's other sort of side effects or side values you can sort of extract out of that. But yes, of course, you'd really like to be able to get more coverage early to get that value. I will also quickly say that with the bidirectional contract stuff, that's a way to be able to quickly get more value because you're reusing tools you've already got. So again, hypothetically, you've got, let's say, a website in React, and you've got that covered with Cypress tests, and you've got an API that's got an open API spec and is tested through Dread or Postman or whatever, you can upgrade that into a contract testing workflow pretty quickly, which just means you're getting a bit more coverage quickly, and then that can buy you some time to do maybe more thorough contract testing with something like Pact as you go along.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Welcome. Good last question, I think.
Yeah.
We're right on, I was going to say 6:30, which is probably 8:30 in UK and 9:30 in Eastern Europe. Should we ask if there's any other questions? I'm happy to hang around a little bit longer, to be honest, if there is any more. I think my daughter's trying to ask me a question. Hopefully you can't hear that.
No, not at all.
Cool. Okay, well, maybe we'll wrap it up then if there's no other questions.
Just want to jump in and just say thank you everyone for attending. We hope that you got some value. If you do have any other questions that pop up, feel free to join us on the Pact Slack channel. I will share that with you just now. We've got an AMA channel there which you can join and just ask those questions that you have of Matt at any point you feel. Here is the link. There we go. So I'll just give you a sec if you wanted to click on that to join up. Otherwise, we will wish everyone a great day. And Matt and I will go enjoy our evenings.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Goodbye.
See ya.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Bye.